Hello, everybody. So today we are going to talk through the beginning parts of Jason DeLeon's book, A Land of Open Graves. Content warning for this book, there's going to be a lot of graphic descriptions of state and border violence. There are going to be mentions of sexual assault, and there's going to be some pretty graphic descriptions of death and decomposing bodies. So what I'm going to do today is I'm primarily going to lecture on the first couple chapters of the book that y'all didn't read, and I'm going to pull that material out and explain it so that you have the conceptual basis, but given that we only have a couple more weeks, I really wanted to have the things that you read. I wanted for y'all to focus your own reading on the more evidence-based chapters, the more data-driven chapters. So this week you're going to read an ethnography chapter and a physical anthropology chapter. And I can just explain the concepts to give you the larger conceptual context that he's building in the book and the larger argument through this lecture. So if you want to know more about this stuff, most of what I'm going to talk about is coming out of those first couple chapters. Um, the key issues are going to be how does the U.S. Weaponize land to enact violence on undocumented migrants? This is a big piece of Jason DeLeon's argument. This is actually the main thrust of his argument, that U.S. policy relies on environmental processes to enact violence on migrants. It puts migrants in these kind of subtle ways in dangerous and precarious situations on a systematic level, and I'll explain all of this in a bit, that make it more likely to experience trauma, harm, and death. That violence is then sanitized in the language used by policy and the way we talk about these things. So how does language functions to sanitize and to hide systemic violence? And then how do U.S. policies also rely on those same kinds of environmental processes to then hide the very evidence of the violence, to hide, for example, the bodies themselves? Now, the big policy that we're talking through in this book is going to be prevention through deterrence. This is a kind of organizing strategy that the U.S. has adopted since the 1990s for how to manage manage, I don't know, the border. Manage is a strong word. Again, well, I'll explain it later, and then it'll make a little more sense. And then the concepts that are going to come out are the weaponization of land. How is the land weaponized to enact violence? The state of exception, and necroviolence. Now, the reason why I assigned this book, and I think this is a really excellent book for a 101 class, is because Jason DeLeon is going to use all four fields of anthropology. And he's going to say, how do the different subfields of anthropology help us understand how structural violence operates on the border? So, as a quick refresh, this model of the four fields of anthropology, it emerges out of Boasian anthropology in the early 20th century. And the goal was to study the quote-unquote whole of human life, past and present, cultural and physical, etc., etc. Now, fast forward a century, and most anthropologists are not trained in the four fields, right? Because over 100 years, that's a lot of time for people to write things down and to publish articles. And now it's kind of a bit too much. You can't really master all four subfields. So people end up specializing in one. I'm a sort of rare case in that I do specialize in both cultural anthropology and archaeology, and I draw heavily on sociolinguists. But that's more of the exception than the rule. And so Jason DeLeon is going to take this older approach and he's going to update it for us. He's going to say, how do we take this Boasian approach and then make that something that makes more sense in contemporary anthropology, particularly with contemporary anthropology's interest in questions of power and violence and social inequality. So how do we update this four-field approach? So essentially, we're going to use these four different subdisciplines to and we're going to treat them as tools, as frameworks, as approaches. And so how do these different approaches help us get at the underlying problem of border violence? How does it help us understand that underlying problem from multiple kinds of perspectives? And as we do this, remember that part of his point is going to be that the language of policy sanitizes that violence to make, or sanitizes that violence to make it look invisible. So then how do these different anthropological approaches work together to help make those invisible forms of violence and trauma visible again? How do we take that violence that has been naturalized, that has been normalized, that has been made invisible, and how do we make that invisible once again? On pages 3 to 4, Jason DeLeon lays out the thesis of the book, right? It's actually not that dissimilar from what y'all learned about 5-paragraph essays. Just instead of paragraphs, we're talking about books. We're scaling up the idea. Each chapter is going to have its own little thesis that it will, support. But then the book itself has a thesis, and then each chapter supports that main thesis as well. And so the main thesis of the book is the terrible things that migrating people experience en route are neither random nor senseless, but part of a strategic federal plan that has rarely been publicly illuminated and exposed for what it is. A killing machine that simultaneously uses and hides behind the viciousness of the Sonoran Desert. Okay, so in the sense of that idea of a strategic federal plan, what he's referring to is a specific set of policies called prevention through deterrence. We'll talk more, I'll define that a bit more later. And his point is, okay, so migrating people, undocumented migrants they're experiencing pretty horrible forms of trauma and pain and violence and death, right? As they try to cross the border. And his point, Jason DeLeon's point, is that these forms of violence, these horrors, are neither random nor are they senseless. They are rather a strategic federal plan that uses the Sonoran Desert and hides behind the Sonoran Desert. It uses these environmental processes of the desert itself to enact that violence, but also hide behind it to make that violence invisible. So Jason DeLeon's goal in this book is going to be to take that violence and make it visible again. That's what he's trying to do. And in terms of this argument about the policy of prevention through deterrence, the idea he's going to outline for us is that basically this is a policy that it mobilizes the non-human ecological processes of the desert itself to enact violence against migrants. And that is actually an important foundational part of U.S. border policy. It's not just the wall. It's not just border agents. It's using environmental processes themselves to enact violence. And then this violence is then disguised. If this structural violence of border policies is disguised in three main ways. The first is through sterilized discourse. What this means is we use language and policy that sounds less bad. It hides the graphic reality. So, for example, we call the policy prevention through deterrence. That sounds a lot better than forcing undocumented migrants to cross the border in the most dangerous parts of the desert where there is not easy access to water, where you will literally be baked from the inside out by the sun, where the rocks will tear through your shoes, and leave your feet bloody and you're left trying to walk with these without even having shoes because your shoes themselves have been torn up, and then those rocks are now doing that same damage to your feet. All of these kinds of things, right? Prevention through deterrence sounds better than letting migrants die in the desert or forcing migrants to cross in places where they are more likely to die, because that sounds bad. This is a common strategy in a lot of policy. For example, when I was a kid, there was a law passed. It was called the No Child Left Behind Act. The No Child Left Behind Act sounds a lot better than if your kids in your school aren't scoring well enough on tests, we're going to cut your funding. So we say the No Child Left Behind Act. And this is going to come up throughout the book. For example, there are other, like another term often used in policy is hostile terrain. Again, hostile terrain sounds a lot better than all those things I just described. Um, it's a way of sterilizing the language, a way of making it look, it's a way of hiding the violence. The second mechanism is by redirecting blame. Essentially, because if migrants are dying as a result of exposure out in the desert, the United States can then claim, well, we didn't kill that person. They chose to cross in this dangerous location. It was the environment that killed them, and that's unfortunate. But it's not us. But what that does is that hides the way that policy itself systematically it systematically pushes or incentivizes migrants. Maybe incentivizes is the wrong word, but it creates conditions in which migrants have to cross in those dangerous locations, and that is in fact an essential part of how the policy functions. And then it also disguises this violence through natural environmental processes, by which I mean if you die in the desert, the environmental process of the desert will then lead to your body being eaten by different animals and decomposed extremely rapidly. So even the evidence that you were alive and you died in this way is erased by the natural and environmental process. What that means is, so for example, we are not able to get an accurate count of how many deaths occur as a result of these policies. We don't actually know the full extent of how deadly they are because the physical evidence of those deaths is erased by the environment itself. So this violence is being disguised in these three ways: sterilized discourse, redirected blame, it's not our fault, it's the environment's fault, and natural environmental processes that erase the very evidence of the person's death itself. So this policy, prevention through deterrence, was passed in the 1990s and continues to shape policy to this day. And basically, the idea is that the United States concentrates its resources or Border Patrol concentrates its resource in the sense of surveillance technology, the physical positioning of border control agents in such a way that it concentrates those forces at places where it is safer to cross. For example, places where there might be towns or cities close to the border where people can stop and get things like water. And so by concentrating the personnel and technology in those kinds of locations, they then it is less concentrated in places, for example, in the middle of the desert or through the mountains where it is extremely dangerous to cross. And the idea here is that because there is so much concentrated resource in those towns or along places where it's safer or easier to cross, places where you can get to a town pretty easily or relatively easily, that by concentrating Border Patrol agents in those locations, undocumented migrants then have to choose different locations to cross. And those locations then, the United States relies on the dangerous environment itself to police those borders, to in lieu of having human personnel, the environment will do that work for them, is the idea. And so undocumented migrants then end up are then in situations where if they want to cross, the way to cross is through these dangerous places. You have to make choices. For example, do you want to go through a flat part of the desert where it's easier, the walking is easier, it's less arduous? Or do you want, but then it's also easier to get caught? Or do you go through the mountains where it's going to be, there's going to be, it's harder to get caught, there's less people there, etc., etc. And as a result, but then migrants are then forced to be in a situation where they are going through those locations, right? The rocks and the mountains that cut through the shoes, as I said earlier, all of those things, right? Then the sun baking your flesh, all of that has a stronger effect or takes a bigger role. And so Jason DeLeon says, like other federal government security jargon, prevention through deterrence has no graphic reality behind the words. It's a semantic cloak that hides all of the blood, sweat, and tears from the public view. So he asks, what hides in the shadow of hostile terrain? And in this picture, I have for you, each red dot represents a documented body of a migrant who died on the process of crossing the border. And I'm going to bring this up in class and think about what kinds of patterns do we see in this data and how do we understand it. This data was collected by an organization called Humane Borders, or Fronteras Compasivas. And the idea, right, what this organization does is they provide water stations. So what they do is they look at this data to say, oh, where are people most likely to die? And then that tells us where we need to put these water stations. So the red dots are documented deaths. The blue dots are water stations. And we can think about this information in class later this week. On page 17, Jason DeLeon dives into this idea of structural violence that we've been talking about a great deal, and he's going to give us a couple new tools for how do we think about structural violence as it applies specifically to the context of border violence. Now, one of his points that he makes is that violence is both productive and destructive. Now, it's pretty straightforward, I think, for most of us to understand how violence is destructive. It harms people. It can kill people. That is destructive. But violence is also productive in the sense that it produces our social realities. It has social effects. So, for example, remember when we were talking about gender, and I said, hey, if gender is an arbitrary social construct, how do we maintain it as a social reality? How do we create a world in which this idea of a gender binary, for example, has any level of coherence to it? And the answer is through coercion, right? We have systems through which we reprimand systematically, or I'm just blanking on the word for it, but cause negative impacts for people if they are seen to, quote unquote, not be doing gender the correct way. There are systems of reprimand. I just can't think of the focus. There are negative impacts that are created, right? There's coercion that happens. We maintain the social reality through systems of coercion, through logics of coercion. And so that coercion, that violence, produces the social reality of gender, of the gender binary. Now, Jason DeLeon is going to show us something very similar at the border. Violence on the border is productive. It produces a social reality. It produces the idea of that we are Americans, that this is America, that those words mean something, that there is some coherent reality being described here. it produces the social reality that this line in the sand that people in an office negotiated over and drew on their maps, that this line in the sand is more than just an invisible line that some random person in Washington, D.C. imagined, or in Paris, or wherever, but that it has a tangible reality. We make that line in the sand meaningful through violence, by enforcing the border through policing and other kinds of mechanisms and other policy and systematic violence. We create the social reality that this line means something, and that if you cross it without the right paperwork, all of these things are going to potentially happen. We create the social reality of what it means to be a citizen of an American, right? American, a citizen or not. And all the rights and things that we expect along with that citizenship status. For example, if you're charged with a crime, you will probably expect a fair trial if you are a citizen. If you are not a citizen, for example, if you're an undocumented migrant, you may not be legally entitled to that same thing, right? So the border and border violence is productive of this social reality, of these larger concepts, these constructions, what it means to be an American, what it means to be a citizen. And that reality that we experience, that social reality we experience on an everyday basis, is getting made here on the border through this kind of violence. His second point about structural violence is we can think about structural violence as including non-human actors. That non-human beings in the desert and the environment, the landscape itself, play a major role in enacting border violence. It's not just the humans. It's also the sun and the effect that the sun has on migrants' bodies. It's the rocks that cut through your shoes, to go back to that earlier example, right? That these non-human beings are also part of the system that the United States enrolls in order to enact border violence. Policy enrolls the environment, enrolls environmental processes into its policy to enact border violence. Now, his third point is that the ways people die in the desert reflects a precarious political position. Nobody's going to die in the desert if they aren't already in a precarious situation. People don't choose to put themselves in this super dangerous situation if, they're a very comfortable, middle class, highly well protected, everything is going great for them. That is not a situation in which people are going to cross the border without documentation. There are the reasons people cross the border. It can range from any number of things, just off the top of my head, like escaping political persecution or conflict or turmoil in their home countries. It could be escaping domestic violence. It could be seeking economic opportunity because their families which their families lack at home, right? In which they might be struggling with severe poverty. Whatever the reason is, right? People only cross this desert if they are in a precarious political situation in some way. And so we can think about what are those underlying root causes leading to migration, right? And that is a function of precarity. And he has this quote that the post-mortem biographies of corpses, what he means by that is basically the stories we can tell by studying the body, what we can learn from the body about how that person lived and died, that these post-mortem biographies provide insight into the production of trauma that has a hemispheric reach. So the stories told by corpses trying to cross the border help us understand the social production, the systematic production of trauma that reaches across the northern and the southern hemisphere. Because it's not going to just be the person who dies
it's also their family members who don't hear from this person again and don't really know if that person is alive or not anymore. Or all of the other kinds of ways in which that trauma affects not just the person crossing the border, but their families, their friends, etc., and etc., and the way that trauma reaches through space. And on page 39, right, Jason DeLeon is going to explain a little bit more what he means by that sanitized language. So if prevention through deterrence, he says there's no graphic reality to that image, right? When we imagine prevention through deterrence, there's not necessarily a picture that we would imagine that goes with those words. So he wants to paint us that picture. So what hides in the shadow of hostile terrain? Flesh roasting temperatures, steel walls and remote ground sensors, thousands of heavily armed agents on the ground. What about venomous snake bites or bandits with the propensity to gang rape? Shoes that break apart after staggering in them for miles over lonely mountains. An undiagnosed heart condition exacerbated by days in the desert. Although all these things and countless others have become incorporated into the Border Patrol's system of enforcement, none of those realities are captured by policy rhetoric. But the deployment of the word deterrence is not just a political magic trick to mask. Oh, yeah, I'll just leave there, right? So what is that? How do we give that reality a bit more graphicness? How do we paint a picture to describe what these words actually mean? And his argument, right, is that the United States is enrolling all of these processes, right? It's into the border policy. It's not just the agents. It's not just the walls and the remote ground sensors. It's also the flesh roasting temperatures. It's the snake bites. It's the bandits. It's the undiagnosed heart condition exacerbated by days in a desert. All of that is part of how border policy operates. And the word he uses for this is this concept of hybrid collectif, which is a complicated sounding word for actually a very simple, straightforward point. Basically, what he means by this is that our social systems include non-human beings and environmental processes. So when we talk about border patrol, as I've been saying, right, or I'm sorry, not border patrol, border violence, and border policy, we have to talk about the ways all of these non-human beings and processes are enrolled into policy to enact violence. And so on a technical level, his argument is for this idea of hybrid collectif is that agency emerges in relationships between humans and non-human actants or sources of action. Instead of thinking of like agency as something that is exclusively to human, we're now thinking about it as something that happens in relationships. He uses the word actants, which is just a jargony word it's the same thing as an actor, just with the assumption that an actant is not necessarily human or even conscious, like that rock that rips through your shoes, or those series of rocks, the miles and miles of rocks, that's an actant as well. The sun and the flesh roasting temperatures, that's an actant. So hybrid collectif, it sounds really complicated actually, but what it actually refers to is that social action is a function of human beings and non-human beings alike. And we need to think about non-human beings and processes when we think about border policy and border violence. So all of this raises this fundamental question for Jason DeLeon. How does U.S. border policy weaponize the land? And to get a little further into this material, I'm going to talk about some of the theoretical frameworks that he's drawing on in order to kind of set up where he's going to go over the next couple chapters. I don't need you to know the next three philosophers I'm going to talk about. I'm just kind of giving you context to set these things up. And these are names that if you continue in the humanities or social sciences, you will probably encounter again. So I'm just kind of flagging them, but this is not something you need to, I'm not going to test you on this. So Jason DeLeon is really interested in this idea. He draws on this framework of the state of exception. And I'm going to explain that, and to do that, I'm just going to set it up a little bit, because the state of exception is an idea that comes out of the philosophical works of Agamben and Foucault, particularly. Foucault's the one in the leather jacket, Agamben is the other guy. These two people are philosophers who are really interested in how do we understand state power and violence, particularly in the wake of the Holocaust. Because the Holocaust really, it was a set of events and situations that far outstripped dominant theories of how the state operated. Like, it was just a kind of shock in many ways because it didn't fit within people's understandings of how, for example, the state is supposed to operate. So there's all of this energy that happened into, okay, how do we, in academia, how do we understand what happened here? How do we understand that? And so these philosophers are trying to understand how the Holocaust emerges from normal state operations and mechanisms. Now, the key here is this idea of the state of exception. That's the idea that, what am I trying to say? State of exception that Jason DeLeon is drawing on. A state of exception is basically a situation in which the government is able to legally suspend the rule of law. Now, Agamben in particular is he's the person who this concept, the state of exception, comes from. He coined that word. He's studying concentration camps specifically. And so concentration camps are a place in which the government is able to suspend the rule of law, but in a way that's legal. And so there's a contradiction here, right? It's this moment in which the government is actually able to do things that would normally be considered illegal, that it would not be able to do. It's able to break its own laws. But it is a legal mechanism that allows the state to break its own laws. So in concentration camps in the Holocaust, for example, that happens by stripping Jewish populations of citizenship. Because once people in concentration camps are stripped, and it's not just Jewish people, it's many queer people, other minorities, religious groups, etc., right? Once stripped of citizenship status, these populations no longer have protection, no longer can expect the kinds of rights that come with citizenship. So now the state is able to exceed its own laws and do things like the Holocaust. Whereas normally in a state, if you wantonly kill citizens, for example, that's generally seen as illegitimate. And so there's all of these kinds of moments where the state is able to suspend its own law. So one example of this was when I was living in Charlottesville, in Virginia, and the Unite the Right riots were happening. The state government actually declared a state of emergency and sent in basically riot troops, not riot troops, what do you call it? Riot police in, to break up the protest. Now, this was a really interesting thing that happened. So the Unite the Right riot, the idea was it would be this kind of what was the word we used to use? This alt-right kind of movement of people gathering, and then there was the counter protest, which was organized by two factions, really. Many factions, but most of those factions, most of those people, those organizations, were either doing nonviolent direct action, or they were anti-fascists who were more militantly engaged in community defense. And at this point, it's very clear, right? Like, people in this movement, the Unite the Right movement, they were very clear about the kinds of violence they were planning on enacting in our communities, right? Like, we had really good intel. We actually had better intelligence than the police, and so we had pretty good surveillance of their communications, and it was explicit. Like, they were very clear about their plans. Um, and their plans to harm. And so I was part of the nonviolent direct action group, and we actually ended up fucking, we miscalculated severely. Our strategy was that we expected the police to intervene and to arrest us. And then that would create these images that would spread across national media, right? Of, look, the police are arresting like clergy people who are peacefully counter protesting, while these white supremacists are running around and doing all of this shit. Like, look at, and like, this is a common strategy in nonviolent direct action. It goes back to MLK. The idea is that violence, like racism, it's like so everyday and mundane, it's not visible, right? Similar to what Jason DeLeon is talking about. It's naturalized, it's invisible. So how do you make that violence visible? One way is you create a situation in which that violence becomes a spectacle through things like mass arrests. And then people are able to see, oh, hey, this thing is happening and it's not right. That's the strategy. Now, the problem is the police didn't intervene. They actually just kind of left us to die. And it was very clear. And if you listen to like the clergy people who were on the front lines, that is what, that is what it was like. They were like, oh shit, we're in a situation we could very easily die here. And we counted on the police intervening, and they didn't. And now this is where Antifa came in, because they showed up prepared to enact violence on white supremacists to defend our communities. And you can listen to, for example, Cornel West, who was on that clergy front line, talking about how, yeah, we miscalculated, and if it weren't for Antifa there with like fucking homemade riot gear and stuff, like they would have killed us all. And so we were really lucky to have them there. Um, and the strategy that Antifa used was different, right? Our strategy was about getting like public audience on our side. Antifa's strategy was not at all. Their strategy was to slowly escalate the conflict bit by bit by bit until it forced the state government to declare a state of emergency and stop the entire everything. And that actually worked. The governor declared a state of emergency before the Unite the Right people even got their first speaker on stage. They got that. They got everything shut down like before it even started. So that was actually extremely successful. Now, what the governor did there was he created a state of exception. Normally, you cannot call the police, you cannot call riot police to break up public assemblies. However, a state of exception, the state of emergency, is a legal mechanism through which the state is able to violate its own laws. This is an instrumental piece of how Nazi Germany was able to rise as a fascist power, was through this logic that's embedded in every nation state, including democratic ones, of the state of exception. And what we start seeing in this theory is that this line between fascist and democratic state governments, that we often think of them as two different things, we actually start saying like, oh, they're actually not that different. They're actually based on the same core basic logics and procedures. And that's what makes it so easy for a democratic state to become a fascist state. Because ultimately, democratic states are already doing all these things anyway. And we see that in spaces where there is a state of exception, which includes border zones, where people are not granted, right, undocumented migrants don't have citizenship and the protections that come from that, and thus are in a state of exception. We also see states of exceptions in things like prisons, schools. Let's put that one back. State of exception. Hospitals, for example. In a hospital, a doctor can chain someone to a bed, which is normally a violation of their rights, but that's a state of exception. And these states of exception are actually very normal parts of how we organize society in a nation-state system. Now, in a state of exception, violence is organized based on three main ways. One is the reduction to bare life. What this means is we strip people of their life as like citizens, as human subjects, and reduce them to their biological processes, right? You are left biologically alive, but you are stripped of your social life and your political life. So, for example, undocumented migrants are stripped of their political rights. Well, here's a good example too. Is a prison, right? In a prison, the state keeps you alive, right? The state is invested in maintaining your biological life, but you are stripped of your political rights. You are reduced to bare animal life. Another mechanism is being left to die. This is a situation where conditions are created where the state's not going to kill you, but it will you will be left in a situation where you are statistically more likely to die. The Flint water crisis is a good example of this. People are left in a situation where they are more likely to die. Anti-trans laws are these kinds of logics too, right? By increasing suicidality rates among trans youth, trans youth are left in a situation where they are let to die. They're not being killed directly, they're being left to die. And this happens all the time. For example, when I was an adjunct professor in 2020 during the pandemic, I didn't have health care, which means if I got COVID and it was really bad, I would be let to die. In a situation where other people, for example, people with more political clout or money, could access even, for example, experimental treatments. So certain populations are granted access to medicine and even cutting-edge medicine, while others are left to die. We saw this in mass scale with the idea of essential workers, right, being put in situations where they are more likely to die and then left to die. And then you can be targeted for death, meaning the state can specifically target someone to kill them. We see that, for example, in military zones, conflict zones, war, and we see it in police brutality and the killing of, for example, black men and women, like we see in the Black Lives Matter protests. So the question that this framework helps us think about is, what are the social and bureaucratic logics that determines where anyone exists in the system? Are you being placed in that reduction to bare life situation or being left to die? And how is this governed? Like, literally, what is the paperwork involved? For example, when Obama wanted to kill someone with a drone strike, he couldn't just do it. He had to file a bunch of paperwork, right? There is a bureaucratic logic that governs who is targeted for death. And we can understand all of that on an anthropological and sociological level. So that idea of the state of exception is actually quite important to the book. So I don't need you to know Foucault and Agamben or this next philosopher, Mimbe, but I do want you to be thinking about that idea of a state of exception and how that applies in this book. Now, the third philosopher I'm going to mention is Akil Mimbe, who outlines this idea of necropower. Basically, what he's saying is, hey, Foucault, Agamben, they're important, but they're putting too much emphasis on these kinds of processes of maintaining bare life and not enough on that process of targeting for death. That idea of targeting for death actually comes more out of Mimbe's philosophy. That word that I used comes directly from Mimbe. So he is writing in a later time, he's writing in the context of the War on Terror. So he's thinking very much, how does the War on Terror, how do we understand the operation of power and violence in the context of the War on Terror? And for him, he's saying we need to put more emphasis on that role of targeting for death. And he says the ultimate expression of sovereignty relies to a large degree on the power and capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. So for Mimbe, this is what state power consists of, right? What state power does is fundamentally it dictates who will live, who is made to live, and who must die. Another way of thinking about this is who is killable in the eyes of the state. Whose death legally constitutes a murder, which is seen as illegitimate and illegal, and whose death is not constructed as a murder, who is constructed as killable. This includes, for example, people in war zones, particular people in war zones, right? Are you, what do you say, Are you an enemy combatant, or are you a someone caught in the crossfire? Um, we see it in police brutality and killing. Who's Are these actions legally constitutive of murder, or are those individuals who the police kill, are they killable in the eyes of the state? Is that considered legitimate or illegitimate? And what are the bureaucratic logics that govern who is seen as killable? Who is socially constructed as killable without that death being regarded as murder, which is a legal category, meaning that makes that death illegitimate. So for Mimbe, we really should understand the nation state as what he calls a relation of war, meaning the idea of war is it's fundamental, it's instrumental to every aspect of how we govern our lives. Because what we saw with the war on terror was the construction of new enemies. And those enemies were both outside the United States, but they were also people who were but they were also within the United States. So there's enemies within and there's enemies without. And we see the introduction of new policies like mass surveillance and security in airports, which never used to exist. That's all I remember before that existed. When you could just walk up to the gate and say goodbye to your loved ones. And the idea, right, is we're now thinking about the world as like we have to protect society, quote unquote, or the nation from all of these enemies within and without. We see that very much in today's politics. What populations are constructed as an enemy? For example, an enemy of the traditional family. And so his argument, right, is this idea, that relationship of who is an enemy is instrumental to social organization in nation states. And he says killing in the name of sovereignty or killing in the name of state power, it's about the tangibles of life and death. A suspected terrorist disappears forever into the bowels of Guantanamo Bay. A drone strike in Yemen intended to kill al-Qaeda fighters ended up vaporizing members of a wedding procession. A 15-year-old kid walking down a Nogales, Mexico street, shot in the back 8 times by Border Patrol, standing on the U.S. side because they thought he was throwing rocks at them. And I apologize, that quote comes from Jason DeLeon, not Mimbe, but he's illustrating this idea. This idea in which state power relies on constructing these logics of who is an enemy and who is marked for death. And so, in summary, right, what we're looking at is a set of policies or called prevention through deterrence that systematically organize violence, death, and trauma against undocumented migrants. And it does that by enrolling non-human beings and environmental processes into policy, using them as actants who are able to enact that violence against migrants. And so, to understand this, we need to think about the relationship between structural violence and human and non-human beings, but also this idea of this state of exception and the bureaucratic organization of violence and the ways in which violence is constructed as either legitimate or illegitimate, as either a person who is killable or a case of murder. And why aren't these cases considered murder? And how does that operate to make border violence invisible? So here are a few discussion questions just to think about while we read the next chapters. How is the desert weaponized as a part of U.S. border policy? How is language sanitized to make that violence invisible? What are the larger impacts of the environmental processes that cause the physical erasure of migrants' bodies? How does that impact things like policy and our understanding? And how do the different approaches of each subfield of anthropology help us understand border violence in new and different ways? How does each approach take us deeper into understanding these systems of violence and trauma? and the kinds of social worlds that they create.